Happy Friday, everyone. Everyone who's tuned in. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to visit with us and be a part of this workshop. My name's Carl Young. I have several of my colleagues that are going to be speaking with you today. Resma Menakim is in the house. We have also Stacy and Bukata, who are also on board with us today. This is a fantastic opportunity, and I really want to take the time to welcome you to today's workshop. It's called Building Systems for Culturally Responsive Integrated Care. This is session 3 of this series, and this particular focus today is going to be on racism, trauma, and the social determinants of health. With that said, we recognize that all of the marginalized and urban parts of the urban community are not here at the table to be a part of this with us, so we want to acknowledge that. But we also would like to really take the time to really hone in on the issues that are pertinent to our specific communities, especially the African American community of the Twin Cities, and sharing a lot of this information of what can be done so that we can improve our life chances and improve the quality of the services that we're providing in these communities. With that said, I'd like to turn it over to Stacy and Bukata so that they can take us away.
Thanks, Carl. Thank you, everyone who was able to join us online today. And then for those of you that'll be watching this taped at some other point, we know that these are really strange times. So we hope everyone is staying safe and healthy, not only physically, but mentally as well. It can be tough to be self-isolated and to not be in your usual patterns of trial. So reach out if you need some help, reach out to a friend. Just take good care of yourself and each other as well. So last month we talked about implicit bias, had some great experts talk about that and gave you some tools to think about, read up on. Also for this month's topics, which are trauma, racism and trauma, social determinants of health, we've provided some resources for you to take a look at, do some journaling on. And so maybe in your downtime, you'll have some time to do some journaling and read a little bit further into that. So to get us started for this month, I'm going to turn it over to Bukata, who's going to kind of do a bit of an introduction and some backgrounding, and then turn it over to Carl and Resma. All right, thank you.
Welcome, everybody. This is Bukata. I just wanted to kind of go through a quick recap of the prompt topic and information that we sent over, in particular as it relates to racism and trauma, its impacts on health, and then also the importance of addressing the social determinants of health as we look for better solutions to change the inequities that we are getting right now. So just a couple of points. One, from the material we sent over, in particular talking about uncovering racism and trauma from the article in the American Psychological Association, talking about uncovering the trauma of racism. It talked about how racism, according to the DSM-5, could lead to a diagnosis of PTSD. And so, one, I just want to acknowledge the real effects racism has on us as individuals, and then in particular on folks of color. But they said at times it goes undiagnosed or missed by mental health service providers because they are unaware, one, of the impacts of discrimination. They fail to recognize experience of racism as trauma, so deeply impactful to folks. And then, or they fail to inquire about experiences of racism at all. So in terms of their engagement with their clients, they fail to even ask questions about racism and how that impacts their lives. We also learned that it has real or racism can lead to worse health outcomes as well. And so this comes from the article from the Center of Health Journalism. And it said how racism and microaggressions lead to worse health and worse health outcomes. So a couple of things from that. So one, researchers at Columbia University found that racism can result in traumatic stress. So again, a clear link between racism and trauma. And so if one thing you get out of our session today is to understand that the impacts of racism are traumatic, and they have both mental and physical impacts upon folks of color. And in particular, found that racism resulted in traumatic stress, but this was linked to negative mental health outcomes such as depression, anger, physical reactions, avoidance, hypervigilance, and low self-esteem. It was also linked to higher incidence of heart disease in African Americans, and then also the perception of racism was associated with higher levels of distrust of kind of medical professionals. And so I do want to have one caveat and say that it's not only the perception, because we do know historical incidents of racism, such as the Tuskegee experiment and other things, lead African Americans and others to have grounded and real reasons for distrust of medical professionals and physicians. And then I'll end with just the notion of microaggressions and kind of those daily things, those many things that happen that lead to elevated levels of stress and also depression. And then also that depressive symptoms were found to be the link between racial microaggressions and thoughts of suicide by some researchers as well. And so all of that to say, it is critical that we, as we look at the social determinants of health, that we look at the social determinants and not just what happens within exchanges between medical professionals and their clients. Again, 80%, up to 80% of health is determined outside of kind of those interactions with healthcare facilities or healthcare professionals. That includes mental health. And so it's critical that we understand that connection between racism, trauma, and microaggressions on health, in particular, mental health of those impacted most. And so the studies would say African Americans and racism have a higher kind of incidence that lead towards health outcomes such as heart disease, high blood pressure, and also more mental health issues, as well as stated within the two articles. So with that, I will turn it over to Carl.
Thank you, Bakata. Today's session is something that I was very much looking forward to. And in doing the work that we've been doing is looking in ways in which we could change this paradigm in our community here in the state of Minnesota in regards to these issues. We were thinking about how can we present this information and what can we share that hasn't been said? And, you know, in thinking about that, we wanted to have this be really an unfiltered conversation with everyone that's tuned in today in regards to these issues. We haven't made any progress. You know, that's blatantly obvious right now. And one of the reasons we're not making progress is because we don't all know the same things. We don't all have access to the same information. We don't all come from the exact same life experience. So everything that we're doing it really blind, you know. So how can we change that? In order to change that, we have to be able to have honest discussion. And honest discussion isn't always easy and it isn't always comfortable. So while we're addressing and looking at social determinants of health, you know, we understand that for those who are looking at the PowerPoint presentation, you know, and following along, you know, Medicare receives the most funding and legislative attention. We understand that. But studies have consistently shown it's a small relative impact on health compared to the social determinants. You know, the conditions in which a person lives, learns, works, and their ages contribute to their health more than any other factor. The social determinants of health vary by the various populations. That's why when it comes to creating effective care, and we hear, you know, being cultural competency, and that's one word we've been trying to get away from using in the work that we've been doing. You know, we're now focusing on being more culturally responsive so that we can create an effective care management strategy. It's critical that we understand the nuances of every community that we're providing services to. The nuances of the African American community are 180 degrees different from the Hmong community, the Chinese community, the Hispanic community, Jewish community, the Italian community, the Irish community, and every other community that you can possibly name. So if we're providing services and you're service providers and you're working with these populations, you need to understand that coming in the door. And your approach needs to be able to mirror that. So that's really what today's discussion is really all about. How can we help you understand these things? And to take the veil off of it all. And if you feel uncomfortable, that's good. You should. We want you to feel uncomfortable. And then at the end of the day, we want you to say, okay, I feel uncomfortable, but I want to do something about it now. I want to change it. I want to learn how I can become more culturally responsive to those I'm providing services to. Following along with the next slide, what does cultural responsiveness mean? We've created a definition in our group of grantees where we've defined cultural responsive practice as a range of treatment approaches and supports that are derived from and supportive of the positive cultural attributes of the society and traditions that are being served. These services are accepted as being effective by the local community through community consensus and addresses the therapeutic and healing needs of individuals and families from a culturally specific framework. That's what we mean by cultural responsiveness. And for all providers out there providing any type of health care or mental health service in the Twin Cities, that should be a question you should be asking yourself. Is this something that we're doing in our organization? Are we being culturally responsive to their needs? Or are we just trying to put a square peg in a round hole? That's what we're trying to address today with this conversation that we're having with you all. Being culturally responsive is something that we can all do. Every one of us can learn these traits. I can learn how to be responsive to the Hmong community. I can learn how to be culturally responsive to the Asian community. I can learn how to be culturally responsive to the Somali community. We can all learn these things. So this is the focus we want to have when we're creating a culturally specific strategy for providing services in these communities. Let's look at data. 13.2% of the United States population identifies as Black or African American. Of those, 16% have had a diagnosable mental illness in the last year. That is over 6.8 million people, ladies and gentlemen. More than the populations of Chicago, Houston, and the city of Philadelphia combined. Now, where's Minnesota in all of this? If you're looking at this current graph, this is a story that ran nationwide. And about 6 months ago, I presented a workshop at the Office of Justice and Victimization in their annual conference. And I asked a lot of the attendees, how many of them were aware of this? Not one person raised their hand in the audience. And I thought that was amazing because this was a national story. And I said, if I'm a service provider and I live in the state of Minnesota, I would be concerned that my state ranks second in racial inequality, only behind Wisconsin. That would concern me. And we can understand that while all clients are to be treated as individuals with unique needs, the urban minority population clients concordantly feel the effects of healthcare disparities and social discriminations stemming from race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status present in their communities. And it doesn't matter what you have in front of what you have behind your name, we all feel it. Minneapolis consistently ranks among the healthiest and most livable cities in the nation, coming in first place in 2015. But Minneapolis also consistently has a high ranking in the measure of disparities. The first place ranking for Minneapolis as the healthiest city, unfortunately, only applies to those who are not of a racial ethnic minority group and who are not of low socioeconomic status. That should be something that's concerning to all of us. If you haven't muted, please mute so that everyone isn't privy to your conversations on the other side. Thank you. Now, we know that disparities exist. You know, we understand that African Americans often receive poor quality of care, lack of access to culturally responsive medical and mental health treatment. We understand that. There are plenty of studies out there that have addressed these issues. You know, for those that may not know, only 1 in 3 African Americans who need mental health services receives it. Approximately 11% of African Americans are not covered by health insurance, compared with about 7% for non-Hispanic whites. Compared with the general population, ladies and gentlemen, African Americans are less likely to be offered either evidence-based medication therapy or psychotherapy as part of their treatment. You know, these are the disparities that exist in our communities. These disparities are not decreasing. The disparities are widening. These are the issues that we're fighting to address right now with the work that we're doing as grantees around these issues. And we also understand that as a community, we also are part of the creation of a lot of these disparities. A lot of this comes from within our community. And Brother Resma is going to speak on this more when it's his time to speak and address these issues as to why that is. But the barriers that are present within our community are unique to our community because they're unique to our cultural experience. You know, according to the Minority Health Office, the United States Department of Human Services, African American adults are 20% more likely to report serious psychological distress than Caucasian adults, and are more likely to have feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and worthlessness than their Caucasian counterparts. And despite recent efforts to improve mental health services for African Americans, barriers still remain in regards to the quality of care received. And for those that might be unaware of what these barriers are, the barriers are limited cultural responsive providers. I probably can count on both hands and both feet and still have some digits left over, ladies and gentlemen, of the number of African American owned mental health service providers in the Twin Cities. That's a problem. Our community has a distrust of the healthcare system as a whole. Bakata mentioned the Tuskegee experiment, for example. That's just one example of something that was done that's had a negative impact on our community and why we're so distrustful of the system and the institutions that govern it. We also suffer from a lack of knowledge of the available treatments and resources that are available. One of the biggest barriers is that our community denies that we have mental health issues because of the social stigma that's associated with mental health illness and medication and receiving services in our community. We also feel the racism and the discrimination just as the feeling of being dehumanized as a result of the perceived inequality within the system as to how we're being served in our communities. And when you take all of these things in totality, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of work to be done to address these concerns and these issues. How do we remove barriers? How do you remove a lack of a distrust in the entire healthcare system? How do you change that? You know, we're doing work right now to hopefully change the limited cultural responsive providers. There are lots of grassroots organizations in Minneapolis and St. Paul and Twin Cities doing a lot of work in the community that are not part of this conversation today. And we want to change that. Continuing on with these barriers, despite the progress, we know that there's been some progress made over the years, yet racism continues to have an impact on the mental health of African Americans. Negative stereotypes, the attitudes of rejection, have decreased, but can continue to occur, ladies and gentlemen, with measurable and adverse consequences in our community. We still are battling the historical adversity, which is a byproduct of slavery, sharecropping, and race-based exclusion from health, education, social economic resources. All of this translates into socioeconomic disparities experienced by Americans right now in 2020. The socioeconomic status in turn is linked to mental health. People who are impoverished, homeless, incarcerated, who have substance abuse issues are at higher risk for poor mental health. Yet, those issues aren't being addressed. Instead, we're being penalized and we're being placed in penal systems and unjustly incarcerated for issues that many people are being sent home and receiving mental health care services for. Yet we're being treated differently by the system. Now you can understand why all of a sudden we have this disengagement with these institutions. We're not seeing anything happen that's fair to us. So instead of participating, we're disengaging. And it's only creating more and more issues in our communities now. And with that said, I'm going to turn things over to Resma, who will really hammer this point home as to the historical foundation of all of this as he discusses the origins of white body supremacy and its impact on these communities from a historical perspective, because it's important that you understand the foundation in which all of these institutions are based and why they're having the impacts that they're having in our community. So with that said, Brother Resma, you ready to step up to the mic, sir?
I want to say thank you for kind of setting the foundation for a good foundation for what I'm going to be talking about over the next little while. This issue of racism and the impacts and the social impacts and determinants on our people, I think a lot of times people go to workshops or go to things like this and they leave with something, but I don't think they leave with anything that they can operationalize. And what I want to do for a little bit is just talk about some of the foundational pieces that exist when we're talking about how to serve communities better. And so I want to start off with just asking everybody who is on this meeting right now, asking everybody just to notice how much things have changed in their lives over the last 3 weeks. And just notice where we're at right now compared to 3 weeks ago. Just notice the kind of energy, the sense of it, the weight of things on us right now, right? We have been hit with something that has shaken not only our larger community, the United States, to its core, but also shaken our individual communities to its core, also shaken our relationships with our families and our friends. I mean, just the idea of us talking about social distancing, a sense of something has shifted, right? And so I want people just to understand that where we were a month ago in terms of what we're carrying in our bodies, the weight, the speed, the texture, the feel of it is different than what we're experiencing right now, right? That there is a heaviness to people that have been, that are dying from this virus. There is a heaviness to the things that have been occurring over the last month or so. And I would ask that you notice that for a moment, because that weight that you're feeling and that weight that you're experiencing is what bodies of culture experience every day. That weight, that speed, that texture is a weight that's embodied. So when I'm talking about white body supremacy or white supremacy or racism, what I am talking about is not just an intellectual piece. I'm talking about how it is embodied, that it actually lands in our bodies. It has effects in our bodies. The same way you're experiencing this sea change in America and in your body because of this virus is the same, is in some ways what bodies of culture have been experiencing in addition to the experience of this virus. So that weight and that texture and that speed that you're noticing, that's what changes. That's the racialized stress that bodies experience. That racialized stress produces cortisol. Cortisol is only supposed to be in the body for a short amount of time. Once the danger disappears, then that in that short amount of time, then it's supposed to return back to normal. But what if the danger doesn't go away? What if the inequities that exist in the health equities that exist, what if that was structural, not episodic? And many times what we have a tendency to do is speak on these issues. So what we have a tendency to do is speak on these issues as episodic, right? So something quote unquote racist happens, like a president saying Chinese virus, or and doubling down on it. We look at that and say, that's horrible, he shouldn't do that. And then we see that as an episodic piece, as opposed to what we're dealing with when we talk about white body supremacy is we're talking about a structure. We're talking about a system. We're talking about something that exists that transcends transaction. It transcends episodes. These are not about episodes. This is about what I have been saying and what we'll go into over the next little while is the white body is the supreme standard by which all bodies' humanity shall be measured. Now let that sit for a second. You're not supposed to say these types of things in polite company. But if we don't say these types of things, we can't get to the foundation that breeds these types of inequities. These inequities don't just exist in the healthcare system. They exist in the technology system. They exist in the art system. They exist in the religious system, the military system, the media system, the academic system, the governmental system, the law system, the economic system, the science system. If inequities exist in each one of those systems and institutions, it cannot be episodic. It is structural. The white body is the supreme standard by which all bodies' humanity shall be measured. And everything else is a hierarchical deviance from that standard. If we don't understand this first, no amount of types of things we put together to try and address these, if we don't understand to try and address these inequities, if you don't start from a place, a foundational place first, then every time you go to address it, you won't have enough energy to hold it through the long term. You'll only have enough energy to address it in episodes or episodic, but not structural. And what we're talking about is structural. So the reason why I say this is because when we are talking about how the idea of racism, and when I say racism, I say R-A-C-E-ISM, racism of humanity. The race question in this country is primarily a species question first. I want to say that again. The race question in this country is primarily a species question first. And what I mean by that is Resma a monkey or less human than some of my white counterparts? That question was woven in to the very fabric and structure of this society before America became America. America did not become America until 1776. These things that I'm talking about started to come about in the latter part of the 16th century, or the latter part of the 1600s. And so where I want to start with is, if we could put the graph back up again, just quickly. Okay. I want y'all just to look at that just for a moment, take it in, and then I'll explain it. Because when I'm talking about racialization, I'm talking about trauma. It is traumatizing to be born into a structure and into a system and into a society where your body is deviant from the standard. It is traumatizing to the parents. If my mom is a Black mother and my father is a Black father, or any combination thereof, just them navigating this society means that they're having to deal with higher cortisol levels, means that they're having to deal with the stress, the racialized stress on their bodies, which means that affects all of the system, including the reproductive system. So that means that level of stress may affect the eggs, may affect the sperm. So what gets transmitted in gestation is maybe higher levels of cortisol to let the nervous system that's being developed know that things may be dangerous and they need to pay attention to it even before that child comes on the body, comes onto the planet. So racism and white body supremacy and racialization is not a thing that somebody does to somebody. It is a system. It is a structure. And so in 1681 is the first time in Virginia law that you start to begin to see the terms white persons, not landowners, not merchants, white persons. It's the first time you start to see that in law. At that moment, the white body became the standard of humanity, and everything else was a deviance from that standard. And the countries that were at the what I call the foundation of this, France, England, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, those countries, who also were the countries that were intricately involved in the enslavement trade, those countries shared ideas of race. They shared ideas of race through science, through history, through economics, through philosophy, through religion. Those ideas of speciesness were shared among those countries. Those countries were about their own self-interest. Racialization is about self-interest first. And that self-interest was maintained and promulgated through imperialism, colonialism, land theft, enslavement, and genocide. These are the things that I call the five brutalities. The five brutalities operate with power and control and self-interest at its basis, not hate. Hate becomes a byproduct. That's how we always want to get around racism, is that you want to talk about hate. It's about self-interest first. And hate is a useful byproduct to get your self-interest. And so when I'm talking about white body supremacy, I'm saying that those five countries created and utilized the five brutalities And in committing utilizing the 5 brutalities, they developed what I call HIP trauma: historical, intergenerational, persistent institutional, and personal traumas. Because each thing that I'm talking about, each one of these brutalities has effects and lands on the bodies. Those ideas around speciesness and those ideas around race were established in the American and European colonies. Remember, I'm talking about before America became America. So when people are talking about not racist and non-racist and all that different type of stuff, what they're talking about is a transactional personal piece. What they're not talking structurally. Because if we're talking structurally, we're saying that those ideas around speciesness were around, and the white body being the standard, were developed in the American colonies, with the expressness of one of the reasons why was to cleave and put a cleave between people who were poor, not seeing themselves as being connected to each other and having boots put them by elite white bodies. The idea of beginning to put into laws that made white people a separate species, or not separate species, but a separate from other human beings. That idea served the purpose of people not seeing their interests as shared. And then that idea was woven into and developed, the idea of, developed at the same moment that that idea was developed, anti-Blackness and indigenous invisibility was also developed. And white body supremacy as an ethos, as a standard. That was then pushed through and developed. People internalized the idea of white body supremacy and racial hierarchies. And the further you are on the racial hierarchy, closer to white, the more human you are seeing. This is woven into the structure. And the further you're away in terms of being, in terms of darkness, the more less human you are seeing. This is not episodic, it's structural. Those ideas then get blown through and woven through every institution. This is why every institution has racial inequities. This is not just about access to healthcare, although it shows up pretty significantly in terms of mental health and healthcare. But every institution has this, and that's because the white body is predicated on being the standard of humanity. So when I'm listening to people talk, one of the things that I'm thinking is, unless we're going to actually acknowledge that there is, that in this society, there is something to the idea that the white body is the standard. The white body is the standard in terms of mental health. White body is the standard in terms of physical health. The studies that are done mostly are done on those white bodies. The ACEs study was done primarily on white bodies. And so there's no way to address the inequities. Oh, wait, let me say this. If we're really and truly going to address inequities and racial inequities, then we must start from a foundation that says that the white body is the standard first. And if we're going to have diversity, when you say that you have diversity, what you're saying is that you're going to start with something first and diversify from it. And many of us know, but don't want to answer the question. What are we starting with first? When we say we believe in diversity, what is the standard by which we're starting with first? Many of us know what the answer is, but we don't want to say it. And we're starting with the white body being the standard first, and we want to diversify from it. If we're talking about inclusion, what we're saying is, well, if you want to include something, you must start with something first. What is the thing that we start with that we want to include? The white body. Now, some of people that are listening to this are tightening up. They are having an embodied experience. Some have already clicked off the call. Some are having visceral reactions because, and what I will say is that if we are really going to look at the inequities that exist in terms of being a service provider, you must have this as a foundational understanding. Therefore, if you're going to actually be culturally responsive, that means not just culturally responsive just with the people that come through your doors, but personal traumas and issues that are showing up to your front door. And if you don't have an understanding for what it is that is actually happening structurally, you will over time marginalize their experience, not because you're bad, good, whatever your identity, that has nothing to do with this. This is, if you are going to actually begin to address it, it means that you have to look at your own processes and procedures and examine how, not if, it is predicated on the white body being human and predicated on my body being species and non-human, and the indigenous body being invisible. That is where we start. But if you can't do that, then you will find little things to do to tweak around the edges. Really, how we respond better to people of bodies of culture. I would ask that one of the things that we have to do is really come to a different understanding on what we really mean when we talk about white supremacy and white body supremacy and racialization. Otherwise, it's just going to be performance art. All right. So what I'd like to do is maybe, so as I just said that, Carl, what comes up for you as you hear me say some of the things that I just said?
At first listen, because it's really going back to one of the things that I mentioned is, in order for us to progress, we have to learn how to move past being uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And you address that, just with presenting this kind of information. Yeah. It's the truth. Yeah. And there's no way that can be filtered, mm-hmm. To make it palatable. Yeah. It's not what we're shooting for. We've tried to have the indirect conversation around these issues in order to have progress, but that hasn't gotten us anywhere. Right. Right. So, we have to be more direct. We have to speak. We have to actually give people the hard truth. And hope that they're open enough in their thinking to get past themselves, mm-hmm. and not take it personal, because it's not personal. Right. We're giving you a historical education that you have not gotten in your college courses, that mm-hmm. you're not getting looking at a DSM-5, that you're getting in your organizations. Yeah. We're giving you background so that you can have something in your mind when you're communicating with a person of color in their community, right? So that you can have a tool to be effective. If you can understand that struggle, if you can understand that perspective, if you can take yourself out of the equation and say, hey, what do I need to serve this individual? How can I understand how they're feeling? How can I recognize and accept that? Yes, we are dealing with trauma. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter if you're just a college educated person or if you're a doctoral candidate like I am. It doesn't matter. We still have it inside. Right. I still live in this world. I still have to exist within the state of Minnesota, living in this paradigm. Yeah. And to operate within it. So I think everyone should, if they're listening, they should just get outside their own bodies and just say, hey, This isn't about me personally.
Right.
This is,
Right.
I'm getting information that can help me be a better service provider in these communities that are needing quality services provided.
Yeah. The one of the reasons why I was so happy when you guys asked me to do this, one of the reasons why I was happy to do it was because I think we have a tendency to think about inequities as like I said, as episodic. We have a tendency to think about inequities as and then therefore we develop strategies that are episodic, right? We develop strategies that are individual, right? Without understanding that this idea of racialization is actually structural. And that's one of the reasons why I was excited to do this, is because I think if we're actually going to look at our own individual cultural responsiveness as it relates to service, then that means we got to start all the way back to the beginning. We have to start with how this whole thing came about, who benefits and is advantaged from a structure that's based on race. This is not a structure that I developed. This is not a structure that my ancestors developed, right? The idea of race predicated on the idea that the white body, not intellect, not anything but pigmentation, that is a standard of humanity. And then that was woven in the law. That idea is woven through everything that we do. And if you don't examine it in your own institutions, in the very organizations that you belong to, if you don't examine it, then it stays standard. Then the status quo of the white body being the standard, and the ideas and how people survive that stays standard. And so what we're talking about is, how do you begin to develop a lens, an embodied anti-racist lens and practice that will allow you to examine what it is that you do, and whether or not what it is that you do and how what it is that you do is marginalizing bodies of culture.
And Resma, if you could hear me, can you address for them, going back to what you just said? What we're trying to do is get beyond the status quo.
Exactly right.
We're not trying to do business as normal. That has not been effective.
That's right. Business as normal.
How can understanding this change that?
Right. So business as normal is getting it so bodies of culture actually wash out of your institutions at higher rates than others. That they actually don't come for services in ways that other people come for services. That they actually stay marginalized in ways that is different than others. And so the status quo is actually choking the life out of people. The status quo is founded on white body supremacy. So if we keep doing the status quo, we're gonna keep getting what we got. Right. That's why that's why I gave the list of institutions. This is showing up very clearly in the mental health and access to mental health, access to chemical health, access to physical, right? This is showing up very clearly in those fields. But it's also showing up very clearly in every other institution. That's why I'm saying it's structural. So if you're unwilling to develop a structural lens by which you look at this, then nothing will change. So the idea that you're going to just listen to this and then go back to, okay, we're going to have a diversity committee. We're going to have an inclusion committee. We're going to have a committee to develop these different types of things to address this foundational piece is inadequate. Your niceness and your willingness to want to look at things is inadequate to deal with the level of trauma that racialization has done and continues to do on bodies of culture.
And Resma, for those listening, um, let's take it. Let's give them action items.
Okay.
Let's give them a few recommendations. What do you think?
Right. So one of the first things that I think people have to do is that they have to just stop and pause first and not assume that they already have the answer. Right? They just got to stop. Right? Stopping forces you to contend with everything that you've been conditioned to override. Right? And particularly in white bodies, the needing to stop and pause, and especially with things that you don't really have or you have a remedial understanding about as it relates to race, right? Stop and pause for, yeah, you see that? Those are the types of things that I'm talking about, right? The reflexive responses, right, to this idea.
Right.
That those are the types of responses that will not allow people to change the foundational operation of what they're doing, but just tweak around the edges.
Right.
Right? So that's why I'm saying stop. Because those responses point to the fact that you or your organization is potentially dangerous to people like me. Right? Or to indigenous people,
right?
Or to Somali people,
right? Or
to people of Asian descent.
Right.
That response that just came across, the text response that just came across, that,
and Resma, and I appreciate that response because I believe that's at the genesis of where everyone's thinking should be, is to stop and pause and say, hey, where am I on this? Where do I see myself? How can I do something? Well, the first thing to do is, like I said, get outside of yourself, remove your thinking, remove your education, remove your life experience from the equation, and learn how to listen to the experiences and be willing to seek out ways in which you can get information on those who are serving, so that you can provide a service to them in their community that is reflective of their needs and their wants, and that transitions, me towards the end, where I know we have people that are looking for other recommendations and other things that we can do, because the work that you and I are doing with everyone that's involved in this panel is about creating action steps.
Right.
I want this just to be about a conversation, and I know personally, I just have this feeling that a lot of times when we have these kinds of issues, we're talking and we create these cultural diversity trainings and we do all of these things to get continuing education credits. It just seems that it's just information. And then when we walk out the door, they leave it there in the room.
That's right. So one of the first things that I've been having people do, honestly, and this is going to sound like a plug, but it's not, is that I've been having people start with reading My Grandmother's Hands, reading my book, because I address a lot of this stuff in there. And so I start with people starting to read that book in groups, right? I start with having white bodies begin to read that with themselves, and then begin to read it with other white bodies. I have people of bodies of culture begin to read that with other bodies of culture. I think it's important for people to begin to read that, because it forces you to begin to contend with some of these foundational pieces and do practices with it. That's where I think people have to start.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Stacey and Bukata, you still there?
Absolutely.
I want you guys to chime in as well. Let the listeners out there that are watching, those that are watching today, give them a few recommendations. What do you think? Action steps. What can be done? Let's move beyond the talk. What can actually be done? What can be implemented? everyone that's providing services in our community.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to touch on, you talked about culturally responsive. We've used that term in education for quite some time. I think it's newer in healthcare, but the thing about it is really good for everyone, but it also involves people acknowledging and understanding that everyone has a culture. So really understanding what that is, and knowing that that's the lens through which they see things, and that we are often operating already in a culturally responsive manner, but it's only meeting the needs of a very few. And typically it's the people that look most like us that make us feel comfortable. And even in the case when there are people of color offering services, for example, we are still being culturally responsive to white folks because it's a structural thing, right? That's how it is set up. So I wanted to really get people to think about, what is your culture? You need to make sure that you can identify that and be firm in that and be confident. That's okay. It's a place where you start. And then talking a little bit about what Resma talked about. One, when he mentioned how you might have been reacting to what you were hearing, like how did your body respond when he was talking, or throughout this whole presentation? What was your physical reaction to that? Be really mindful of that and think about why that is. And that's something that you need to address. That's where your work begins. Why would you be so uncomfortable with that? Acknowledge it and then begin your work in that space. And then also going beyond that business is normal, because being business is normal is upholding that structural area. And so we have to get beyond that, even when it doesn't seem right or it doesn't seem comfortable, because that's not what we've been used to doing.
Thank you. Bukata, what are you thinking there, brother?
You know, I think Stacey hit it on the head. I would say the thing I would say is, or what encourages that, while the individual actions in being culturally responsive are needed, we also have to challenge the structures in which we are operating within, right? So this notion of the individual acts I do lead a certain direction, but unless it's a collective of all of us doing these acts, the structure and calling out the structure, we still may get some of the same results. And that can be discouraging. That can be, it can disenfranchise folks from wanting to do it. But I think it has to be a both and, right? Both individual acts that we engage in, but also how we as a collective challenge structures to change as well.
Absolutely.
And you know, and remember, challenging the status quo. You know, one of the things, and Bukata just mentioned this, at the individual level, of course, everyone that's out in boots on the ground, providing a service in community, you know, we play a part in it. But, you know, I want to challenge leadership of organizations. You know, if I'm the leader, if I'm the leader of an organization and I'm coming into a community that I'm not a part of, I need to be asking myself basically two questions. One, what is my purpose in this community? Why am I there? Two, if you are there, what are you prepared to do to meet the specific needs, to address the cultural differences, to address the cultural needs of these communities? Are you prepared to have your staff be reflective of these communities? Are you prepared to go out and recruit? Are you prepared to get beyond thinking about westernized methodologies and interventions in interacting and engaging in these communities? Because I can just tell you that's not working.
Right.
DSM-5 is not working in the African American community, ladies and gentlemen. It's not. We're not engaging in that. We don't want to be engaged that way. You're going to have a different relationship with us in order to come at us with these issues. The approach has to be different. The intervention has to be different. And we need to understand that. You know, so I would challenge leadership, you know, are you coming into these communities because it's dollars? Or are you coming into these communities to provide a service that's going to meet the needs of this community? Because we have needs that need to be met.
And one more piece to that is, are you developing a communal culture and relationship with those communities? This is not about people coming in.
Right.
This is about, are we going to build a cultural container by which we can build in that's different than the cultural container that currently exists? And if you're not doing that, like I said, it's performance art.
Right.
So.
And that's the challenge to moving beyond the status quo. You know, and you know, for the sake of time, I understand, Resma, I appreciate you, brother. Thank you for blessing everyone with.
Love y'all. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
And give Bukata and Stacy an opportunity to close us out. Bukata, you got some final words?
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us today. Take some time with the study guide if you haven't already to follow up on this. Shout out for Resma to take a look at his book if you don't already have it. You might want to order it from Amazon.
Or me.
Hey, we're gonna plug you, brother. We're gonna plug you. They might not watch Oprah. They might not have caught you on Oprah. So we're gonna plug you.
Right. If you have some extra time, you do a little reading. So as of now, you should have gotten an email to talk a bit about April 7th. We are not having the face-to-face in St. Cloud for Learning Days. That's been canceled. We may have an online session. We're still working out the details, so you will get more information about that soon. And in the meantime, again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I think emails and contact information are in the material that you've been receiving. And otherwise, we'll be in touch with you about session number 4 and when that'll happen and whether it'll be online or some other version later in the year. All right. Thank you. Have a great day. Stay safe.
Stay safe.
And everyone, thank you. We're also going to provide some information for those that are interested in having further dialogue. If you have an opportunity to pull up the PowerPoint. All right. Up on the screen, you see these two handsome brothers. If you have further questions, you would like to have further dialogue, discuss these issues, you can contact myself. There's my email. You can contact Resma. We're here to educate. We're here to share experiences. We're here to learn. We're here to promote change, and we're advocates for changing the status quo. And we're trying to improve the services that are in our community. For those that are on the discussion board, we hear you, and we'll be responding to all of your questions there as well. Thank you so much for taking the time. Everyone stay safe, and hug everybody close to you. Cherish those relationships. Everything's hectic right now, but this too, we'll move beyond it. Everyone be safe, be blessed.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.